This review is presented by Hot Rod Cameras. Panasonic's GH line of Lumix cameras has been the powerhouse of budget cinematography for years. The GH1 came out the gate shooting 23:9:8 natively, and Lumix didn't stop there. After they saw users installing Magic Lantern on the GH2 to get higher functionality, they came out with the GH3, one of the first DSLR-style bodies to shoot 1080-60, and later the GH4, one of the first 4K bodies. Every time they came out with a new model, they upped their numbers and upped the ante. In fact, the only thing that seemed like it was holding back the GH line was the size of the sensor. But now, with full-frame cameras and full-frame lenses being so prevalent, does a 4/3 sensor still stack up? Well, now with its 2.0 firmware, the GH6 might be the answer to that question.
So I've been using the GH line for a very long time. One of the first short films I ever worked on was shot on the GH2, and I was one of the first in line when Hot Rod was selling the GH4 at launch day. So when I got a chance to mess around with this guy, I was pretty excited about it. I've been playing with the GH6 for about 6 months, and I've played with it in a dozen different environments, trying to really stretch the legs of the camera, because I have a lot of micro 4/3 lenses personally, and if this is the only micro 4/3 camera on the market, it better be good.
On paper, this camera has some very impressive things. You start with standbys of Panasonic, like the dual native ISO and the dual sensor stabilization that works in tandem with the image stabilization inside Panasonic lenses. On top of that, the camera shoots 5.7K ProRes and has a variable frame rate mode that can crank all the way up to 300 frames a second in HD. It also has a dynamic range boost mode, which functions kind of like bracketed HDR at the sacrifice of some of your higher frame rates. And the fun isn't limited to video. For photos, this camera has a 100 megapixel mode using its 25 megapixel sensor and some kind of pixel interpolation to fill in the gaps with the photo. It also has a burst mode of up to 75 frames a second. For $2,200, this camera can do a lot, and the only downside seems to be that sensor size, the micro 4/3 format. So just how much of a downside is it? The easiest negatives to point out with a micro 4/3 sensor are going to be your depth of field and low light performance. I won't really talk about depth of field because, let's face it, that is more on your lens than the camera itself. And let's just say there are a lot more 0.95 lenses for micro 4/3 mount than there are for full frame. In a previous model, the GH5S, Panasonic addressed this by giving the camera a 12 megapixel sensor, making each photo site larger and therefore able to let in more light. The GH6 doesn't have this advantage, and because of that, it reaches its limit of usability, I would say, at about 6400 ISO. For most people, that's not bad, but Sony and Canon have been outperforming that number for years. It's cleaner at 6400 ISO than a lot of other cameras, but with its peak being not much higher, you do sometimes need that range, even if it is noisy. When you are overexposed, though, the GH6 has very, very recoverable highlights, even when you're shooting Rec. 709. But as far as the problems that people are normally concerned about with micro 4/3, this doesn't really help. So if this camera isn't a way around the negatives of the micro 4/3 sensor, then what is it? I've been a GH user for a number of years now, and the biggest draw for me was always the variable frame rate. If you are looking for frame rates above 120 frames a second, there are very few ways to do it this cheaply. In certain sectors, cameras like the FS700 stayed in use for years after they had been made obsolete in other sectors because of that high frame rate capability. If you're on a budget and you need to shoot high speed, there is almost no other option, which brings me to my second point, the budget. Blow for blow, this camera packs a lot of punch, and the GH line has always been packed with functionality. But it's not just what's inside the body. It's about everything else that goes into the micro 4/3 ecosystem. All of it is smaller, lighter, and cheaper. In the last 5 years or so, the market has been flooded with cheaper and cheaper lenses that take advantage of the micro four thirds format, reducing the cost of the lens itself. Whether you want cinema lenses, macro lenses, anamorphic lenses, the option in a micro four thirds mount is almost always much cheaper than the equivalent RF mount or E mount. Making a lens designed to cover a smaller sensor is cheaper, and it takes up less space. This is one of the few areas where the technology will never shrink. A full-frame sensor will always be the size of a full-frame sensor. And as much as I like to espouse the benefits of the micro four thirds mount, that doesn't tell you much about the camera. So let's talk about the camera. User accessibility-wise, Lumix is creating one of the best experiences. Even with a menu so packed with functionality and some that might be in terms that you're not familiar with, they give an explanation as you scroll through the menu, which makes it really easy to find exactly what you're looking for. As you change or format cards, the camera advances the roll just like a cinema camera would, and the storage system is separated out by codec. This way, if you're changing format for a unique shot during a project, you know exactly where that shot is. The camera also has a full HDMI out that can be used in tandem with the onboard monitor, a feature that was missing in their previous cameras. With all the formats this camera has, it's hard not to talk about the most impressive one, and that is anamorphic mode. Several years ago, shooting anamorphic on an MFT camera was a pipe dream unless you were building something out of projector lenses and adapters. Since then though, companies like SLR Magic, Sirui, and Laowa have come out with many options for an anamorphic shooter. To take advantage of those, you need a camera that can preview the image. Now, the GH line has been able to shoot anamorphic since the GH4, but the GH6 takes it a step further. Having a monitor D-squeeze in camera means that you can shoot anamorphic with just the body and lens. This is an interesting feature. It seems like an obvious option, but not many cameras offer it in the micro four thirds format. Although I will say that Zcam is definitely in the GH price point, and they've had this option for years. But regardless, shooting anamorphic has always been cost prohibitive, and having an all-in-one package like this makes it easy. Just know that if you want to shoot in 4x3 mode, you can't exactly go bottom of the barrel, as slower cards and even third-party batteries will lock you out of the higher modes in this camera. With that being said, I do think this is the right camera for someone who doesn't have a big budget to buy a lot of accessories. If you can't afford a gimbal, the dual stabilization might just get you by. If you're not able to have a full mixer, the 4 channels of internal audio might be the way to go. And coupled with an external recorder, this can be a powerhouse setup for very cheap. Panasonic even improves on the simple stuff. Take the internal intervalometer, for instance. Most cameras these days have at least a basic time-lapse function built in, but the GH6 gives you every option you could ever want. And if you want to be lazy about it, you can even do time lapses in VFR mode and have it written as a video file immediately. This camera has so many different modes that you can shoot in, almost too many honestly, but it does tell you very specifically what functionalities are available and not available in each specific mode. The biggest downside to all the party pieces on this camera is that you can't actually use them all at once. 300 frames a second is not only not available in 4K, but it's also not available in ProRes. And your dynamic boost mode has to be turned off. In the same vein, the dynamic boost mode limits your ISO sensitivity on the low end to 800 because your dual native ISO is now no longer available. Now, this is honestly a common limitation from every manufacturer, but with the GH6 specifically, there are so many different flavors that you've really got to spend some time with the camera to get an idea of what's available when. Once you've got the settings you want though, the GH6 is throwing out some really impressive numbers. What has started to bug me this time though is you can only push those numbers so far before it starts to kind of become useless. Let's look at the 75 frames per second burst mode for a second. It's a truly impressive feat that this small camera can even pull that off, but in practice, it's next to useless. When triggering this burst mode, the screen buffers for about 1/4 of a second, meaning the first 20 shots you take are done blind, and the autofocus isn't fast enough to keep up with anything moving at a speed that you would need this 75 frames a second burst mode for. In most cases, it's going to make more sense to use the slower 20 frames a second burst mode, especially because the write time of these photos takes so long after a burst that in many situations you might miss the next thing that you're trying to get after those burst shots. The photo functionality that I was impressed with, however, was the 100 megapixel mode. What this does is it uses the stabilized sensor itself to take 8 nearly identical photos, and it works handheld. From there, the camera uses an algorithm to stitch together the photos similar to a panorama, but instead you get a very, very high resolution image. It is by no means the same as a true 100 megapixel photo, but it interpreted moving objects pretty well, and it doesn't really have any digital noise issues. It's a really cool way to get a high resolution photo in a pinch, and that is kind of what I like about this camera. It is a camera that is easy while still being packed with functionality. Some manufacturers make an easy to use camera by limiting your options, and the GH line does the exact opposite. They give you as many tools as possible and cross their fingers that you're going to use them wisely. One of the best examples of this is dual stabilization. It's not full gimbal stabilization, but it'll get you out of a tricky spot and get you a usable shot. The stabilization doesn't do well with pans and tilts, but on a tight it can give you a nice handheld float, and on a wide angle it can give you some smooth movement. Out of the box, this camera can almost always give you the type of shot you're looking for, even if it's not a perfect version of it. It's almost like it's a previs camera. With the right FOV conversion, you could plan out a whole feature by taking this to location scouts. For that reason, I like it as a very high-end vlogger's camera. It's cinematic enough when you need it to be, but also easy enough to use when you don't want to deal with that. It seems like Lumix might have had this idea as well. In fact, there is even a record button right under the front of it where your thumb would land if you were holding it on a stick. Pretty much exactly how a vlogger would hold it. This camera also supports 4 channels of audio. 2 are accessible through the hot shoe on top using Panasonic's add-on XLR device, and the other 2 are accessible through the 1/8" jack. So you can pretty easily have 2 lavs and a shotgun without having to rely on a mixer. There are a few things that make this camera a little less budget-friendly than previous models, however. The camera does have dual card slots, SD and CF Express, but most of the party piece functionalities that you actually want are only available on CF Express cards. But I'm kind of burying the lead here because everything that I've said so far was true of the GH6 at launch, and the GH6 has had a big firmware update. Firmware 2.0 allows for 12-bit raw output over the full HDMI. This is specifically designed to be recorded with an Atmos Ninja V or Ninja V+. The GH line has a history of running in tandem with Atmos. In fact, when the original Shogun was announced at NAB, there were also 2 cameras that used the 10-bit 4K functionality, and one of those cameras was the GH4. So now you can record Apple ProRes RAW in a 4x3 sensor in 5.8K in anamorphic mode. You can also output 17:9 4K at 120 frames a second, and the whole kit will fit in your carry-on. That's what I love about Micro Four Thirds cameras, that's what I love about the GH series, and that's what I love about the GH6. I have spent a lot of time with this camera, and as a GH user, it feels like the next logical step. Everything is bigger, better, and stronger. But is this camera good enough to validate being a Micro Four Thirds shooter when Lumix is one of the only brands still supporting Micro Four Thirds? For me, this camera is only missing one thing, and that's an internal ND. With dynamic boost mode and ProRes both putting limitations on the low ISO, I found myself always wanting to be a stop or 2 darker. But don't let the cost of a variable ND stop you from getting this, because I wouldn't expect any other MFT cameras to be this good anytime soon. But with that being said, the low light shooter in me would love to see Panasonic give us a GH6S. Thanks very much for watching. I had a lot of fun shooting with this camera, and it's been a while since I've gotten to go this in depth on a single camera. If you want to know more about the GH6, you can check us out at hotrodcameras.com or visit our storefront. Until next time, I'm Joey Rassool, and I can't wait to see what you shoot.